Would y'all thank the team for me? Well, good morning again. It is good to be here with y'all, and we are in the final week of our series, Money Matters, right? So we've been talking about everybody's favorite thing to talk about, or at least our second favorite thing to talk about in church. First is politics, and then it's money. And so we're going to wrap up the series today that we've been in, and just going to share a few things with you this morning, but love to just actually start with a story. So we're going to talk about tithing this morning. I've been warning you that it's been coming, and so we're going to talk about tithing this morning, and I'll kind of give a definition to what that is if you're kind of unfamiliar with that term in just a second here. But boy, when I was a kid, I grew up Lutheran, and just a really traditional Lutheran conservative church, great church, actually. I really did love it. Put some really deep theological roots inside of me, and so I appreciate it for that. But I remember once when I was in probably 6th or 7th grade, my parents brought me to a meeting at the church that they had to go to. The board at the time and the senior pastor at the time had basically said that if you're a member, you must come to this particular meeting, and it was a one-on-one meeting with either a board member or someone from the finance team at the church at the time. And so my parents took me along, I don't know, as a learning experience, and this moment has just stuck with me for whatever reason. And so my parents were in the church library at the time, and it was one of those church libraries that was just old. All the books smelled old, so it just had that musty, stinky smell to it. And I remember sitting there, and the entire purpose of the meeting was so that the finance person or the elder could basically explain to my parents what biblical tithing was. In other words, when we say tithing, in one sense, we're talking about your financial support of the church. And so they were explaining what biblical tithing was and how all Christians are mandated basically to tithe their income. And so they had this explanation with my parents, and then they pull out a card and they looked at my parents and said, now you need to write down in front of me how much you're going to tithe, and it has to be a tithe, and you're going to sign your name on it, and you're going to commit to that for the next year. And that was the point of the meeting. And I could sense the tension in the room when that happened. Again, I'm 6th and 7th grade, so I don't know that I fully understand everything that was going on, but I remember it being uncomfortable because my mom would shift in her chair and she'd look at my stepdad, and there were these stairs that went between the two of them, and I could just tell they felt a sense of pressure, and it was an uneasy sense of pressure from this really sweet old lady, and she was very persuasive with her words. And basically they made my parents sign a tithe financial commitment card that they were going to give this amount for the rest of the year. And my parents were gracious with them in that meeting. They were kind in the comments. They signed the card. I have no idea what number they put down. But I do remember that the conversation in the car on the way home was not as gracious. They were not impressed. They felt pressured. They felt like it was a pressure tactic by the church to get my parents to give whatever amount that they wanted them to give. And again, I'm 6th or 7th grade, and that story has always just stuck with me. That was my first exposure as a young person in the church to this whole idea of tithing, right? To financially supporting the church. And the reason I tell you that story is because if you're a church person and you've been around for a while, you have probably heard of the concept of tithing, perhaps believe that you tithe. The reason I start with that story is because my hope, my honest hope, is that the conversation that we're going to have this morning about tithing is the exact opposite of that experience for us. That there's not a sense of unnecessary pressure. That there's not this guilt that hangs over us as we talk about money in the church. Nobody should ever give out of compulsion or guilt. And so my prayer is that we have just the exact opposite from that. So what I want to do this morning to get us started actually is I just want to define first, before we get into the rest of my thoughts, what do I mean when I say tithe? Because in 20 plus years of being in ministry, what I found out is that there's a misconception just around the actual word tithe and what it means. I think for a lot of followers of Jesus or a lot of Christians, the tithe is just the donation that we give in any amount, whatever the amount is. But there actually is a very, very specific definition to that word, and just the black and white definition is tenth. A tithe is literally, it's a word that gets translated and it means a tenth. So in this case, it means 10%. So when you hear the word tithe, for instance, if you were to make $500 a week and you gave $20 a week to the church, you would not call that a tithe technically, because it's not a tenth of the 500. It's a donation to the church, which is great. But if you made $500 a week and you gave $50, that is called a tithe. And so just as we start the conversation, I just wanted us to all be on the same page with clarity around what that word actually means. Because again, there's been misconception around it. And I also want to say this just at the beginning of our time together. When we talk about giving to the church, I've already said it just briefly. I don't ever want anybody giving out of guilt or compulsion or pressure. I also don't necessarily want you giving because I stood up here and talked about giving for 30 minutes and you felt like, oh, okay, I suppose I had better do that if I'm not already. The reality is I want you to give to the church and to the work that we're doing here because you believe in our mission. You believe that what we're doing is actually helping as many people as possible experience God, freedom, and life. I want you to give because you believe that's happening. I want you to give because you believe that we're investing in the next generation. I want you to give because you believe that every Sunday when we open up our children's ministry, there are 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds and second graders and fourth graders that we are literally putting the story of Jesus into. We're planting the seeds of faith and we are partnering with parents and we're helping to raise the next generation of church and doing whatever we can to put faith into them so when they step into the world, they take Jesus with them. That's why I want you to give. I want you to give because when you see youth, teenagers running around destroying me with paintballs, by the way, you know that we're planting seeds of faith in them as well. I want you to give because you believe that it's possible every single Sunday somebody is walking in here or watching online and it's the first time they're hearing the gospel. It's the first time they're hearing about the freedom that is found in Jesus Christ. It's the first time they're hearing about the forgiveness that is found in the cross and in a surrendered life to Jesus. I want you to give because your heart is moved by the generosity of God. I want you to give because you realize how generous God has been to you and to us, and that you are moved by his generosity. Your heart is moved by his generosity. In fact, the entire conversation around tithing is a heart issue. At the core of it, it's all about our heart. That's why I think Jesus, so if you're with us a couple of weeks, 3/4 of Jesus' parables are about money, possessions, wealth. A third of what he talked about, his recorded sermons, are about money, possessions, and wealth. Over 2,300 verses talk about money, possessions, and wealth. But one of the most famous statements that Jesus made about our money, possessions, and wealth is Matthew chapter 6, verse 21. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus says it's a heart issue for us, that our hearts will always follow and be attached to that which we treasure the most. And I think that one of the things that Jesus is doing here, and this is from his most famous sermon that he ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. This is one of the topics he decides to tackle, just our stuff and how our heart is attached to it. And I think that one of the things that Jesus is saying here in this statement is that if we're willing to redirect some of our treasure toward God, then what inadvertently also happens is our heart gets redirected towards God as well. He doesn't need our money, right? I mean, God, it's a silly thought to somehow suggest that God needs our money and that's why people like me are on the stage talking about it, but God talks about it all throughout the scriptures. It has nothing to do with his need for your money. It has everything to do with his desire for your heart. And so this morning, what I want to do is I want to just take a few minutes to share with you why I tithe, why Brenda and I tithe. And some of this is kind of my personal journey, but I want to talk to you about why I tithe. And here's the thing I want to say up front here is I'm not talking about why I tithe so that I can stand up here and pat myself on the back in front of you all and be like, look at me, and I give a tenth, and I'm so faith-filled, and I'm so good, and blah, 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 blah. That's not the point. I'll be real honest with you. The reason I want to talk to you about why I tithe is because for a very long time, I never did. I didn't believe in it. And I had excuses for not doing it. And what I want to do is I want to share with you the 3 reasons today why I choose to tithe. And listen, I'm not legalistic about this. This isn't about the tenth. It's about your heart. But I want to share with you just 3 reasons why I do tithe. And the reason I want to share those 3 things is because, ironically enough, the 3 reasons that I tithe today were the 3 excuses I gave myself 20 years ago for not tithing. They were the 3 things that I kind of had said, well, that's just why I don't, or that's why I can't. But what has happened to me is I have just allowed God to speak to me. I've opened myself up to his voice in this area of my life, money, possessions, and wealth, and said, God, what would you have me do? And over years, he has brought me to the place where I will never not tithe because I understand how powerful it is. And so I'm gonna just share with you 3 reasons that used to be excuses, but they're now reasons. And we're gonna go through, and I have way more to say than we have time for. So I'm gonna have to talk fast. All right, so the first reason I tithe today is simply this: greed. Just greed. What I mean by that is I'm greedy. And I always have been. And that's not some sort of self-deprecating, false humility thing. No. My flesh is full of greed. I've said this before, if I were to walk into REI, which is a hiking, camping store, I forget that there are hungry people in the world. I'll take all of it. You may have all of my money right now. The Apple store, I lose all sense of any good thought financially, because I'm greedy. It's built into my flesh, and I've struggled with this for years. And here's the thing, here's just a simple definition of what the word greed means. It's an excessive desire for wealth or possessions. But there's also sort of a cultural definition to greediness as well. I think when we think of greed, we probably think of the person who's just, it's about me, it's me, and it's not about you. All for me, none for you, none for you, none for you. And there's probably some truth to that. So we could take these 2 definitions together and say that I wrestle with greediness. And the thing is, the Bible does not mince words at all about greed. Check this out from 1 Timothy. This is the Apostle Paul writing to his friend Timothy. He says this in this letter he writes, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." Not evil itself, it's just a root of, money is not evil, but the love of it is. Some people, listen to this next statement, eager for money, and you could say possessions and wealth, have wandered from the faith, and they have pierced themselves with many griefs. Go back to Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 6, where he said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That is exactly what Paul is saying. He's saying, I have watched some people in the pursuit of wealth, in the pursuit of money, wander away from their faith, wander away from their relationship with God, because that became the primary thing. He says, you've got to watch out for this. In Luke chapter 12, verse 15, check this out from Jesus. Then he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. It's that you can't have possessions. That's not what the Bible ever talks about, that you can't have a home and that you can't drive a car. That's never it, but it doesn't consist in those things. In Colossians chapter 3, going back to the Apostle Paul again, he writes to the church in Colossae. And one of the things he's writing about here is he's talking to this brand new church about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. In other words, we should look different than the rest of the world. How we talk, how we treat other people, there should be a difference in our character, in our speech, in our behavior. And in one little section of this letter that he writes to the church in Colossae, he says this: you have got to put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. He lists a few things off: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed. He says you have just got to put it to death. Now, I just want to, for a moment, pause here, because I'm reading these verses, and as I was going through this, here's what I think most of us would probably say about greed or being greedy. We don't see ourselves as greedy people. I mean, if I were to come out into the audience and just put a microphone in front of your face and say, are you greedy? You'd be like, no, not really. I don't think I'm greedy. And again, we measure our greediness based on what we see in people that we think are greedy. But Paul does something that was so eye-opening for me in this verse that changed my definition of greediness. It took it from just being about this pursuit of excessive wealth and money, or me. It took it from that to something completely different. In fact, Paul, in this verse, I'm going to show you the last 3 words of the verse here in just a second. He defines the word greed, but he gives no definition to any other word he puts up there. He only gives extra definition to greed because of how powerful it can be in our life. And what he does changed my perception of greed. Here's what he says about greed, which is idolatry. Okay. If greed is idolatry, I'm just talking about me, I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble. Because idolatry is any time you give attention and affection, more attention and affection to it than you would God. Idolatry is anything that you give more authority and power to in your life than you would God. Anything that sets on a higher shelf of importance in your life that you do God, that's idolatry. And what Paul comes along and says in a just honestly a really convicting way is that greed is nothing more than idolatry. And over the years, the Holy Spirit has had to just wreck me in my soul to help me realize I hold money, possessions, and wealth often in a higher place than I would the God who rescued me. And that makes me greedy. And so one of the reasons that I tithe today is because tithing has become a way for me, if you put that next slide up for me. Tithing is a way for me to ensure that my money, possessions, and wealth never become the idols they long to be. It's a way for me to say to those things in my life that long to be idols, that long to possess me, that I refuse to put you any place higher than the God who rescued me. And so what was a reason not to tithe has now become the reason for me to tithe, and that's the first one. The second reason is a little more complicated, to be quite honest, and it's a bit churchy, of a churchy conversation, but if you've been around in the church for a long time, you've probably heard this one. And it's simply this, that we no longer live in the Old Testament, we live in the New Testament now. Right? And we don't have to obey the Old Testament laws, which is where the whole concept of tithing originally came for. In fact, I'll put a bunch of verses up here, just the references. I'm not going to go through the verses because we just don't have time for that. But these are some of the most significant verses in both the Old and the New Testament where tithing is talked about. In Genesis chapter 14, we meet a guy by the name of Abraham who tithes 1/10 of all of his wealth to a priest named Melchizedek. Interesting story. story, fascinating story. But that's the first time we see the origin or hear of this concept of tithing. In Genesis chapter 28, there's a guy by the name of Jacob. He has this really strange dream. Maybe you've heard it. It's Jacob's ladder. He has this dream of a ladder that goes from earth to heaven, and angels are going up and down on it. And in this dream, God says to Jacob, I'm going to pour out wealth on you. I'm going to pour out prosperity on you. And when Jacob comes out of that dream, he says, if that's what God is going to do for me, then I will give him a tenth of everything he blesses me with. In Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30, that's where God makes it a law for the Israelites. He gathers the Israelites together after they've been enslaved for 400 years in Egypt. He gives them a whole bunch of laws, and one of them is what is known as the law of tithing. That you were to give a tenth or a tithe of your prosperity, wealth, to the Lord. And in Matthew chapter 23, this is where we jump into the New Testament. Jesus is having some arguments with a bunch of Pharisees. The Pharisees were religious teachers of the day. They taught the law to people. And one day, he's having an argument with them because he comes to the Pharisees and says, listen, you guys use tithing to make yourself look good. You use it to make yourself look righteous. You love to drop your coins into the coin drop and make a whole bunch of noise so people look at you. You use tithing to make yourself look good. But then he says you forget about things like justice and mercy and goodness and grace. And in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says, not only should you tithe, he uses the word, but you should also show mercy and grace and goodness. But what has happened over the years is a lot of Christians will say, okay, but we just don't live in the Old Testament. God instituted the tithe thousands of years ago with the Old Testament Israelites, but we live under this thing called grace now. When Jesus came, he fulfilled all the laws of the Old Testament. We don't have to live by them anymore because his grace covers us. We don't have to use the laws to earn our way to God. That's what most of the laws were for. We can just rest in the grace of God. And because God has shown us this grace, it means we're free from the tithe as well. Here's what's interesting. In Matthew chapter, I think it's 6 or 7, or it could be Matthew chapter 5 as well. Jesus, again, is giving a sermon. And in the sermon, he talks about the Old Testament laws. And perhaps when I say Old Testament law, what you think of is the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt have no other God before me. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not, all those thou shalt nots. Those are certainly the laws, but there was a whole bunch of other laws that God gave the nation of Israel, of which tithing was one of them at the time. And Jesus is giving this sermon, and he looks at the crowd, and he says, he picks out a couple of the Old Testament laws. He says, you have heard it said that you shall not murder. He's talking about the Old Testament law. He says, you've heard it said that you shall not murder. But then Jesus says, but I say to you, that if you have anger in your heart, you have already murdered your brother. What's he doing there? He picks another one. He says, you've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery. Old Testament law. He says, but I say to you, if you have lust in your heart, it's too late. You've already committed adultery. What Jesus is doing is he's taking these laws from the Old Testament and these particular ones, and he is not reducing them because of grace. He's elevating them to a higher standard. And this is important. Yes, hear me clearly, there are certainly some Old Testament laws that we are not bound to. The reason we don't sacrifice goats and pigeons on the stage anymore is because we're not bound to the sacrificial system of laws. When Jesus died on the cross, he was the final sacrifice. We don't abide by those anymore. We do not have to abide by the purification laws. If you were considered to be unclean in the Old Testament, physically, spiritually, in any way, there were all these different rituals and rites and rules and laws that you had to follow in order to be made clean, to come back into the church, or to be right with God. We don't follow those laws anymore because Jesus' blood on the cross is the thing that makes us pure before God. The truth is we're not bound to the Old Testament laws. That is 100% accurate. We don't live there. We live under this New Testament grace with Jesus. But let me just ask a question. Of the 10 commandments that you do know of, thou shalt not murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't covet, which one of those are you willing to compromise on? If society looked at the list of 10 commandments and said, we don't live there anymore, we would descend into chaos. And we see it when society doesn't pay attention to them. The truth is, we don't live under the law of tithing anymore. I would agree with that. But when Jesus comes along and says that there are some laws that are still right, that are still wise for us to live by, and he elevates those laws, I look at something like tithing, and I just had this realization, and this was a very convicting realization for me, is that I was using grace to reduce my responsibility to be generous. I don't live in the Old Testament. I live under Jesus now. His grace covers me, and it frees me from that. And the truth is, it does. But I simply couldn't use grace anymore as an excuse not to be generous and not to give. And what I realized, this is the second thing that I've realized in my journey with tithing, is that the grace of God for me should actually increase the generosity from me, not the other way around. And I had to wrestle through this one. The third one, though, is the most important one to me, and it's been the biggest struggle when it's come to tithing. And it has to do with fear. And honestly, another way to say that, like it is just fear, but perhaps a more honest way to say that is to say, can I really trust God? Like if I choose to tithe 10%, or if I can't start with 10% because I just don't even know how that would be possible. If I choose to start with 2 or with 3 or with 4 or with 5 or whatever it would be for you. If I choose to decide to start giving to the Lord, can I trust that he will be my provision? And for the longest time, I had this fear that he would not. I was afraid that I would give whatever percentage, no matter how much it was, and I would be short. There was a fear that I couldn't trust God to be my provider. But in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus, going back to that famous sermon that he preaches, he makes this statement: look at the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or stow away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? And I had to settle in my heart that I am more valuable than a bird. I am. And I've got to learn to take Jesus at his words. It doesn't say that the birds don't work and they don't produce and they don't work for the food that they have, but somehow God has provided a way to make sure the birds have what they need. How much more valuable are you and I than a bird? In Philippians chapter 4, going back to the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Philippians says, and my God will meet all your needs. Not once. He'll meet our needs. According to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. For the longest time, I simply didn't trust God that if I tithed or gave any amount, that I would have enough, that I would be able to survive, and that the God of the universe would provide for me. That is until this. This is a nickel. And I want to tell you the story of the nickel, because this is what changed it for me. I mean, the Lord has wrestled me through this greed and this grace, New Testament, Old Testament stuff, but this right here, this nickel is the thing that has changed it for me. 20 years ago, my wife and I were married. In fact, we just celebrated 20 years last week. And when we went on our honeymoon, we went to Colorado, and so every year we go back. So actually, we're going back to Colorado next week to hike some mountains, so that'll be fun. But I remember about 7 months into our marriage, it was a Friday, and it was payday. And so I do what I usually do. Called the bank just to check on the balance, see how much my paycheck was. And I knew that at the time, we had about $5,000 in our savings account, and then whatever else was gonna be put into the checking account from my paycheck. And so I called the bank thinking, okay, let's just see because I worked an hourly job at the time, and so paychecks were all different. And when I got on and listened to the balance, it was, you have $0 available in your checking account. I clicked on the savings account. You have $0 available in your savings account. Obviously, something isn't right. So I call the bank and I say, hey, today was payday, should be a deposit. I know we had like $5,000 in our savings account. That's all the money we had to our name. And they said, no, it's accurate. This morning when the bank opened, we seized your accounts. And we seized every dollar. And they proceeded to explain to me why. And I'm going to simplify this story. I mean, I am going to simplify and dumb this story down because it's a very, very, very complicated story. But well over 20 years ago, some of you know that I went through a divorce well over 20 years ago. And when I went through that divorce, my former wife and I, we ended up using the same attorney. Somebody had recommended, just use the same attorney. It'll be cheaper and easier that way. And I had no idea. I was so broken and hurt, had no clue what to do. And this was a person that I had trusted. And I said, okay, that makes sense to me, I guess. So we used the same attorney. He drew up the paperwork. And mind you, I'm still pretty young and stupid and broken. And I signed off on some things in the divorce agreement that I had no clue about because I didn't read it. Just ignorant and naive. And in that divorce agreement, there were some financial obligations that I agreed to that I didn't know about. And a couple of years, it took them 2 years, but what happened was 2 years after that divorce paper was signed, Brenda and I, we ended up getting married, and about 7 years into our marriage, what happened was we decided to combine our accounts because we had still had separate accounts, and we thought it's just so much better if we put all of our money together. So we put all of our money in a brand new bank. We disconnected from the banks that we were a part of before, put all of our money in a brand new bank, and the brand new bank that we put our money in is the one that I had the financial obligation to that I didn't know. And the moment it was Friday, that business opened, they took it all. Every last dime. So I went home from work that day and I had to tell my brand new bride that we have nothing. It's gone. And we're not getting it back. She was not pleased with this. At all. So we had a very interesting conversation, and I think we just went to bed that night. We had our kids that weekend. We had nothing to even buy groceries with. Zero. The next day was Saturday, and we had a couple of acres on the house that we had, and it butted up against about 20 other private acres. There was a church that owned a huge plot of land, and they gave us permission to walk on it. So I would go out in the back, and there was a creek that ran through the back, and I would go and pray. There's a little bridge that went over the creek. So I would go and pray, and Saturday, the next day, I just went back to that creek. I walked the bridge, and I didn't even know it, but while I was on the bridge, I reached into my pocket, and I pulled out a nickel. I literally did not have 2 nickels to rub together. I had 1. And I probably walked that bridge for hours and just prayed, God, I don't know what to do. We are broke. I cannot believe I have messed this up. How could I not known that? How could I have been so stupid? This is gonna ruin our marriage. I mean, I was just all over the place, but I said, God, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? I'm desperate, God. I have no idea. Payday isn't for another 2 weeks. How in the world are we going to survive this for the next 2 weeks? You wanna talk about fear and wondering if we could trust God. So I walked that bridge for probably 2 or 3 hours, and I just was flipping the nickel, holding it in my hand. It was literally the only money I had to my name. The next day was Sunday, and we went to church. At the time, we were going to a church over in Grand Rapids, and we were sitting there listening to the announcements and listening to the beginning of the service, and I'm just sitting there, arms crossed. I did not want to be there. It was the last place I wanted to be. I didn't want to stand, I didn't want to sing, I didn't want to worship. I wanted nothing to do with any of it. I was so mad and so angry. And so I'm sitting there and I'm staring at the ground, and at one point after announcements, everybody gets up to, it's worship time, just like we have here. And so everybody gets up and worships, and I do not get up. Arms crossed, straightforward. At about the second song, I'm just feeling so defeated that I decide, I just put my hands, my elbows to my knees, my hands, or my head in my hands, and I look down, and square between my feet is a nickel that was not there when I sat down. Now listen. My best guess is that somebody during worship, when they got up, had their hands in their pocket, they pulled their hands out, a nickel fell, and it literally, you can't make this up, church. It lands between my feet, and I'm sitting there staring at a nickel. I have no idea. I pick it up, I put it in my hand. What do you think the first thing I saw on the nickel was? In God we trust. For some reason, it leapt off the nickel. I didn't hear a word the preacher said. I have no idea what songs they sang. I just sat with the nickel in my hand. Now that's a cool story, but that's not even the best part. The next day, my wife goes to breakfast with 2 friends of hers that she hasn't seen in probably a year. Just 2 really good friends. One of her friends called and said, hey, I want to catch up. And my wife, she took the day off because she was just so distraught, so she took Monday off. She goes and has breakfast with her friends, again, that she hasn't seen in a year. They haven't caught up, they haven't talked to each other. And my wife just unleashes the story. She's like, I have to tell someone. I just have to tell someone. I don't know who to talk to, but you guys are my good friends, and so I'm gonna tell you. So she tells them everything. We've lost everything, they took everything. I don't know what's gonna happen. I don't know what we're gonna do. I don't know how we're gonna survive this. And her good friend is sitting across the table from her, staring at her like a deer in headlights. Of course, my wife is thinking, okay, I've just embarrassed myself. I've said too much. And so she looks at her friends and says, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have unloaded on you like that. That's not what you came here for. And her friend looked at her and said, Brenda, I cannot believe the story you're telling me. She grabs her purse, reaches into her purse, pulls out an envelope, slides the envelope across the table to my wife, and says, I came here today to give this to you. She said, I've come into some money, and you are such a good friend to me. I wanted to bless you. And she opened the envelope, and inside was a check for $1,000. She hadn't talked to my wife in a year. She knew nothing. 2 days later, I'm not making this up. 2 days later, a friend of ours walks into our house because he heard about what happened. He hands us an envelope with $950 cash inside of it, says, I understand you need this more than me. The point of this story is not that you're gonna go home today if you decide to tithe or if you decide to give in any amount and there's gonna be a pile of cash on your doorstep. That's not what the point is. The point is that God can be trusted. That's the point. And tithing is nothing more than a transfer of trust. That's all it is. It's a statement that says, I trust you, God. So as the worship team comes back out, I want to leave you with the words of the Apostle Paul. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, here's how he instructs the Corinthians. Each of you should give what you have decided in your, and we're right back where we started, your heart. Because that's the issue. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. The only thing I am asking you to do this morning is pray. And to ask God, what would you have me, how would you have me order, live, and structure my finances to honor you, to make sure I destroy any idols that I have, to destroy greed that wants to sneak in, and to show you that I trust you. That is all I'm asking you to do this morning. So Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and your generosity to us in our own lives, in every way, shape, and form. And we ask this morning that you'll just speak to us, that you will say what you need to say to us in this place regarding our money, possessions, and wealth. God, you have been so generous to us. Would you speak clearly now to us? We're so grateful for this morning that we could share together, and we pray for these things in the name of your Son, Jesus.